Welcome, everyone, to this Leica conversation. I'm Bill Shapiro, the former editor-in-chief of Life magazine. And with us today, which I am thrilled about, is Rachel Elizabeth Seed. Rachel is amazing. She is a writer, a photographer. She was a photo editor at New York Magazine. She is the co-founder and executive director of the Brooklyn Documentary Club, and she is a filmmaker. And today we are going to be talking about her film, A Photographic Memory, which, if you have even the slightest interest at all in photography, you are definitely going to want to see. And you are definitely going to want to bring at least a Kleenex or two, because it is a beautiful, heartbreaking story of how Rachel comes to know the mother that she never knew through, in part, photographers and photographs. I'm so pleased to be with you here today, Rachel. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to chat with you today, Bill.
And I am so excited to talk about your film and talk about your mother, who was a photographer, and your father, who was a photographer, and all of the legendary photographers that your mom interviewed 40 years ago, and many of which you re-interviewed more recently. So, as always, the chat is open, and we are looking forward to your comments and your questions. And at the end of our session here, we'll have time for questions, and Rachel will be ready for them. So I think that I would like to start our program where I started when I first heard about your project, which is with the trailer. And I'm saying that because when I saw the trailer, it really sort of took my breath away. So can we cue that up now?
I have no memory of my mother. She died when I was very young. But when I discovered her interviews a few years ago, I got to hear her voice for the first time since I was a baby.
The first thing is, would you just introduce yourself?
My name is Henri Cartier-Bresson.
My name is Bruce Davidson. I'm Conor Kappa. I'm a photographer.
My name is Lisette Model.
I needed to know more about my mother, so I set out on a journey to revisit the photographers and to find out more about the mother I never knew.
How was it that you decided to become a photographer?
I never decided to be a photographer, and I don't know if I'm a photographer.
She managed to get Henri to talk about the way he photographed.
She was a strong and adventurous woman, and she did things that other women didn't do.
She wanted to live every day, every minute, and she did.
Her amazing drive was tempered by her feeling that her life could be short.
She's looking very youthful there, isn't she?
That was just a few months before she died. When my mother interviewed you, was it in here?
Yeah. I would sit here and Sheila would sit there. You have a lot of your mother in you. You seem to have the ability to make me say outrageous things. Photography is a universal language.
What's that, sweetie? Gonna say something.
She was very, very, very happy to have you. It's a great shame that she didn't live to see you grow up. She's a spitting image of you, Rachel Seed.
Sheila is my dear friend. I say is because she'll always be with me. She personifies life. She is creativity. She is love.
I'm curious what you remember about Sheila.
Okay, see, deep breath, everyone. Really moving, Rachel. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your mom. Like, I know she was a journalist, I know she was a photographer, but which came first? And while you answer that, let's show some of her, some of the pictures that she took.
Well, I think my mom was always a writer. Over the summer, I found 10 of her missing journals. And so they started age 14. And from that age on, she kind of knew that she needed to write. And so that, I think, was her first interest. And so she went into journalism via home economic journalism, which at the time she was told that's how a girl could become a journalist. And once she got into that and worked for newspapers, she ended up in New York working at Scholastic as a writer. And then from there, they used to send a photographer with her on assignments. And sometimes he would flake out, he wouldn't show up, or he was just generally irritating to her. So she thought it would be a lot easier if she could just take her own pictures and sort of manage the entire story she was telling. And so she started taking classes around New York City and got super obsessed with photography. And then eventually that led to multimedia journalism, doing lots of interviews, and then finally filmmaking, which is interestingly the same trajectory that my own career has taken.
So are you telling me that you started in home economics journalism?
Well, okay, so not that part.
Okay.
You remember baking cookies in home economics in school, but that was not related to writing.
So this was the late 60s, early 70s, and it looks, by judging from the photos, that she went to some pretty far-flung places, no?
She definitely did. Yeah, I think the farther flung, the more interesting, the more unusual, the better. So she traveled to Russia, she traveled to Mongolia, all over the Middle East. As a Jewish woman in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, she pretended to be a Quaker while she was traveling so she could be safe. And she went up and down the Amazon River with a bunch of sailors as the only woman, and also to all over Alaska in small airplanes.
Okay, so at that time, it was not all that common for a woman to be traveling to those places, and certainly not by herself, and certainly not with a group of sailors being the only woman. Do you have a sense of where that desire, to go far afield into exotic places and see strange things, where did that come from?
I mean, I have my theories about it, and thankfully, because I've been making this film for 10 years, I've found so much supportive material that explains the answers to those questions. One of my theories is that she was a wandering Jew, that a lot of Jewish people have this sort of nomadic feeling and tendency, which I also feel like I have. But beyond that, she actually started to write a book where she explained that because her parents were refugees from Eastern Europe, escaping pogroms in Russia, that they were afraid of traveling. They were afraid of being Jewish out in the world. And she had the opposite reaction, which was, I got to get out of here. I got to get out of this little, traditional bubble I'm in and spread my wings and do the opposite of what my parents are doing by staying safe. And I think that's sort of how she saw her wanderlust.
So that's interesting. So from what I gather, and you talked about her traditional box, from what I gather, it sounds like she loved her job, loved writing and shooting and going all these places. And yet there were some social pressures to conform to whatever, a normal woman might do in terms of a career. So this might be sort of an odd question, but was she happy?
I think she eventually found happiness, but, and I only learned this through her journals because everybody had such a glowing, sort of take on who she was, because that's what she projected into the world, was her enthusiasm and her sort of love of life. But her inner world was actually pretty challenged at times. And I think she really internalized this idea that girls were just supposed to get married and have kids. Girls of her generation particularly had to choose between work and family life. And she really wanted both, and she always knew that. So she always had this sort of internal struggle to sort of feel like she had to she had to find a man and find,
right,
marry and have kids. And she struggled with that because she was so independent, because she was so smart, and she was so out there in the world. that she wasn't the typical woman of that time that maybe most men were looking for.
But she did find a man who was looking for somebody like that. And she married your father in 1973. And your father, Brian Seed, who was a terrific photographer, he shot for Time and he shot great stuff for Life. And I think we can see a few of his pictures now, which would be great. But to continue with the story while we're looking at your dad's pictures, you were born in London, but then not long after, your mom suffered a severe brain aneurysm, and tragically she passed away. So skipping ahead a few years, how old were you when you sort of first heard about these interviews that she conducted with the legendary photographers?
I don't know the exact age, but I do know that I just remember them kind of laying around my dad's house. So they were these box sets of audiovisual programs, which was the photographer's voice, and their photographs, which was my mother's idea. She interviewed all these photographers, she edited them, she directed the whole programs. And so I found these boxes and I was always curious about what the origin story of them was. But I think it was until my late 20s that I became curious enough to ask my dad, like, so where might all the original materials be, her actual interviews that she did with all these photographers?
So it was sort of in the air in your house, but you came to the idea of wanting to learn about it at a certain time. Was there anything, I mean, growing up in a house with photographers and probably photos, was there anything else that was sort of in the air that you came to understand its significance later?
Well, it's the typical story of like my dad had a dark room in the basement. So I grew up watching him making prints and kind of poking around in the dark room with him and smelling the chemicals. But beyond that, I remember that there was this beautiful black and white photograph in the entryway to our house. And it was a young boy who was carrying one bottle of wine on each side. And I always thought that was my dad as a kid, seeing that picture. And I think it really wasn't until many years later that I realized that was a photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson that had been given to my mother as a gift when she interviewed him. So that was kind of funny, but still to this day, when I see it, I think of my dad because I'm like, oh, there's my dad carrying some wine.
Of course.
Right.
So let's take a look at what I call the interview wish list, which is a document that you turned up during your research, I believe. And it's the kind of thing that at the beginning of an assignment or a project, you kind of write down, who are all the people that I want to talk to? And this list is this great photographers on it. And then let's look at the list of the photographers that she ended up actually interviewing, which is flat out remarkable. When you look at those names, I mean, that is just like pretty top shelf. So what was the idea behind this project and who was it for?
Well, because she was working at Scholastic at the time and her boss there, who actually still to this day is the CEO of Scholastic, his name is Dick Robinson. He would green light her ideas because he had all the faith in the world in her. He loved her ideas. He loved supporting her as an artist. So she came to him with this list. And the whole idea was, okay, these are educational programs. They're going to be sent to schools far and wide across America. They're going to be sent to museums, libraries, and primarily young people will see them. But I think not even the back of my mom's mind, I think in general, she was making them for everybody, but it was kind of under the umbrella of Scholastic and also of Cornell Kappa and the International Fund for Concerned Photographers. It was before the brick and mortar ICP existed. So those were the collaborators.
Okay. So tell us, how did you come to actually unearth all of these interviews?
So when I finally asked my dad, where are these things? He said, well, after your mother died, I sent all the raw interviews to the International Center of Photography for safekeeping. There's actually a letter he presented that said that exact thing. And so I just cold emailed their archival department and got a very enthusiastic response saying, oh, wow, yeah, as a matter of fact, we've got several boxes that are sitting in the archives. We've always wondered, what the origin of these was. They didn't really have any institutional knowledge of where they came from, as far as I could tell. So they invited me to come, and I spent a summer doing an inventory of the boxes. And they were pretty much like a time capsule. They were in perfect condition. There were dozens of audio reels, the original materials. There were personal letters from between my mother and Cornell Kappa, and all sorts of stuff. And I was just enthralled, and I just sat there in their air-conditioned archive all summer, just doing spreadsheets, basically.
Okay, so you did spreadsheets. I'm assuming you listened to some of the tapes.
Not at that moment. Yeah,
not at that moment.
Yeah.
So that happened sometime later?
Yeah, because they were 1970s audio reels, so you needed like an actual like reel-to-reel player.
Okay.
So I made a proposal while I was there that I wanted to digitize all of them, and so
so then at some point you listened to hours and hours of these interviews. I'm wondering, what it was like to hear your mom's voice and to hear her mind at work. And I'm also wondering what your impression of her was.
Well, so by the time that happened, I was working full-time at ICP, and it was a very kind of personal and private experience. I set up the reel-to-reel player. It was actually in Cornell Kappa's former office. He was already gone at that point. But for some reason, they kept his office totally intact. Like his pen jar was there. The photograph of Robert Kappa was still on the wall. It was kind of like entering like he was still there. And so I sat there alone in this room, and I threaded in my mother's interview with Cornell Kappa, which was one of her programs. And it was them joking about, the dog waking up, and, they were in his apartment. It was very kind of relaxed. And I really felt like I was in the room with them. And I felt like I was transported, like it was time travel. And I also was really surprised that my mother's voice sounded familiar to me, because I couldn't have told you that I remembered it. But when I heard it, I felt comforted by it, and it was familiar. And so that was a really just transformative experience, and one that actually inspired me to make this whole film.
So that's beautiful. So the idea for the film, the light bulb for the film, happened listening to her voice in Cornell Kappa's office.
It was shortly after that. I shared it with my colleagues at ICP. It was Brian Wallace, who was the chief curator at the time, and Pauline Vermar, who was my cubicle partner and another curator. And they were just like, oh my God, this is incredible. And I realized through hearing them that it wasn't just like an everyday experience.
So just real quick, how much time did she spend with each photographer, and over how long did this sort of project run? Was it a question of weeks or months or years or what?
It was over 2 or 3 years. Okay. Actually, it was more than that, but she would spend, I think, between one afternoon and maybe 4 afternoons with each photographer, depending on who they were and how much they told her in the first place.
Right. Okay. So one of the premier photographers on the list that she did speak with, a big get, as we say, was Henri Cartier-Bresson. He did not grant a lot of interviews, and when he did not often discuss his methods or reveal his inner workings or reveal much in general. But your mother not only scored the interview, she sort of cracked him wide open, and he just gave her great stuff. And years later, when you spoke with his widow, the photographer Martine Frank, she said this, and I'm going to quote because it's so great. "I've always considered that interview your mother did with Henri as being the best." So here's my question after all that. How did she do that?
Well, that's sort of like her magic, persona that's a bit mysterious, but it's what made her so good. I think it's she was a deep listener, for one thing. And she would kind of hone in on what was important, but she was deeply interested in people and deeply compassionate. And I think people felt deeply heard by her and wanted to open up because she asked very intelligent questions, but they were also very heartfelt questions. And they came from a place of deep curiosity and deep intelligence within herself. So I think, people could recognize that she wasn't just, asking surface level questions, that she actually was considering and deeply pondering these things herself as a writer and photographer.
Well, the interview that she did with Cartier-Bresson just absolutely crackles with wisdom and joy and spirit and personality. And we'd like to try to bring a bit of it to life for the audience with a bit of a table reading. Now, we can't show the clip from the film, correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, because the film hasn't locked yet, and we only sort of want one version of it out there in the world. Is that right?
Yeah, just, for that.
So,
and yes, it's not finished yet.
Not quite finished. So, but what we're going to do is read directly from the transcript. Rachel's going to read her mother's questions, and I am going to attempt to sit in for Cartier-Bresson. Now, as I read this, please, as I read these words, please try to imagine that they are coming from an older French genius with an adorable French accent and all the enthusiasm of like a schoolboy chasing a frog. So here we go. You want to start?
Yes. Have you ever really been able to define for yourself when it is you press?
When to press? The difficulty is that you can't censor yourself and wait just for a top moment and say, that's a great picture. Well, you should be ready, but it's a question of concentration. Concentrate, think, watch, look, and like this, you're ready. But you never know the culminative point of something which is taking place. So you're shooting and you say, yes, maybe, yes, but you shouldn't overshoot. It's like overeating or over drinking.
There's a sense of what happened before and what's going to happen after in a lot of the pictures.
It's a problem of time. It's a fight with time. Space is time. It's a drawing, an immediate sketch done with intuition. You can't correct it. If you have to correct it, it's the next picture. So she really got him to open up. And a few minutes later, prompted by another few questions from your mother, Sheila, Cartier-Bresson begins dropping insight about what a contact sheet reveals about a photographer. So we're going to do another quick excerpt from the transcript.
This is beautiful. I love this picture.
The difference between a good picture and a mediocre picture, it's a question of millimeters, a small difference, but it's essential. Finally, it's always a question of a very small fraction of things. That's why the contact sheet is so interesting, because you see how a man has been thinking photographically, thinking not with his brains, but with his feet, with his eye, with everything in himself. And even for me, that's strictly my way of feeling. I enjoy shooting a picture, being present. And it's a way of saying, yes. And photography, it's like that. It's yes. And there's no maybe. All the maybes should go to the trash. So, I mean, she just really, I've never heard him say anything like that. I just love that. And then 40 years later, you did this amazing thing. You, in 2011, you went back and you interviewed Cartier-Bresson's widow, Martine. And I'm so curious, you went to their apartment. What was that like to sit in the apartment, the same apartment, to be photographed by Martine, to look over the same balcony at the same view of Paris that your mom did?
Well, it was really magical, for lack of a better word. I mean, first of all, Martine Frank was not giving really any interviews at that time. She actually was quite ill when I interviewed her. You wouldn't know it from the interview, but she wasn't well. And she welcomed me in because she remembered, well, for two reasons. She remembered my mother going there, and she remembered how important that interview was. And she had so much respect for the outcome. And also with the help of one of my colleagues at ICP, who Pauline also, who helped connect me to the foundation. But it was so cool to learn that I was sitting in the same place, on the same furniture that my mother had been, and that I was on the same balcony looking out, because on my mother's audio, she talks about she's doing an audio test with Cartier-Bresson from the balcony. So I know that I'm standing on the same balcony with her, and it's just a really cool kind of cyclical feeling of, being there then 30 some years later.
When you just said standing on the balcony with her, who was the her?
With Martine Frank.
Okay.
But I suppose you could say, it felt like I was standing in the same place my mother was standing.
Yeah. When you said that, I got the little chill thing. So yeah. Okay. I have one very sort of juvenile question, which is, was Cartier-Bresson's apartment really cool?
It was beautiful. And there's this, actually, it's funny, we got stuck on the elevator. There's this really old little French elevator, got stuck in there for a few minutes. But his studio, which was also Martine's studio, was up several floors higher. So they had a whole apartment that was just their studio, which I got to sit in and mess around with some prints. And then their actual apartment overlooks the gardens of the Louvre, I believe it is. So you can't really beat that. It's quite special.
Right. So I believe that Lisette Model was the only female photographer that your mom interviewed. What did they talk about, and what did your mother learn? And was there anything that stayed with you from that interview?
So although I've been making this film for a few years, I only just found those raw interviews in my dad's garage this summer. It's really strange, just things keep popping up. But one of my favorite quotes from that, first of all, Model is just an incredibly strong, brilliant persona. I mean, she's just kind of badass. And it was an interesting thing listening to my mother talking to a strong woman versus all these men that were sort of like just kind of buttered up by my mother's presence. But one quote that I liked was that Model said, "So I was told many times that is a strong social criticism I'm doing, and that I'm making satirical criticism of society. And I always say, I did not intend to. That's all I can say. I see something, I'm interested, and I have always a feeling that the picture comes to me. I'm not after it. The picture makes itself. You make the picture. It's a collaboration, which is all that. And you don't know in advance. That's exactly the fun of it. I mean, the discovery, the finding it."
I love that. The picture comes to me. What a beautiful way to think about it. That's great.
And I think like what my mother was trying to get at with a lot of these interviews was like what was actually going on in the photographer's world and their mind and their background that they were making the kind of pictures they were making. And so I think this quote from Model speaks to that, because she's saying, I'm not making a social criticism. I'm in this creative flow and these pictures are coming to me, so you can think what you want. So I think that reveals her process.
That's fantastic. You shared some of the interviews with me, and I listened as your mom went pretty deep with some of the photographers, not just about taking pictures and their process, as you were just describing, which is fascinating, but also about like, how do you live a life, and how do you live a life as a photographer? So was that the assignment?
I think there was no assignment. It all came from my mother's mind, basically. So she kind of assigned herself. But she was a deeply curious person, and she was obsessed with photography and photographers. And as she was trying to be a better photographer herself, I think a lot of her questions came from that place of like, how do these great photographers make this work? Because I want to improve my own work. And so I think it was not only that, but the interviews go way beyond the topic of photography into really existential questions about memory, time, mortality. And these are all questions that my mother was grappling with herself. Mm-hmm. So I think that the conversations are surprisingly deep and insightful.
Was anybody else asking questions of photographers like that in the early 70s? Like your mom, to my eye, seemed to be kind of ahead of her time in that I don't think lots of people were interrogating photographers about the sort of how and why of what they do.
They weren't. I think it was an interesting crossroads in how photography and photographers were perceived, because a lot of the times they were just considered to be, they had a job. It was like, I'm going to go capture a story that exists, as opposed to coming to the story with an artistic eye or a specific vision. So I think my mother's idea to really talk to photographers, I don't know that anyone else was doing that at this time. In fact, Bruce Davidson, when I went and talked to him, said that nobody was interviewing him then. So he was just like, he felt like it was a therapy session. That's what he told me, that he was just lying on the therapist couch, like backwards, like a Freudian, whatever, and just bearing his soul to her. These days, he gets a million requests, but I don't think anyone else was doing this then, and which is surprising, but people were in love with these talks because they were unique and they were really insightful, and people realized that photographers had a lot of fascinating things to say.
So you do something really beautiful in your film with some of those fascinating things, and that you layer the audio of the photographer interviews on top of or alongside the sort of home movies of you and your mom and dad when you were very little, which, given your story, sort of brings out nuances in both the audio and the video. I wonder if we could do another of our table readings with Don, from the transcript of the interview with Don McCullin, the great British war photographer who was so well known for his pictures in Vietnam and the conflict in Ireland. Do you want to read the part of Don, and I'll take Sheila's role?
Sure.
Okay. I'd asked you if under these really frightening situations where you can die, if you're able to photograph.
I mean, no one wants to die. No one with their right mind. I never make these definitive kinds of assessments of whether I should take pictures or whether I should be there. It's dangerous. I might get killed. I must put up with the consequences.
In a way, you sound as if your pictures are almost more important to you than being alive. Is that right?
My pictures, they're not more important than my life or anything else that surrounds my life. There's nothing like living a full life, nothing in the world to compare with it. I don't want to die for a few pictures. I want to live for every sunrise I can clap my eyes on. And I want to see my family get older. And I want to see the world try and be a bit more peaceful and understanding.
Could you say a little bit about what your feelings are when you leave in terms of your family?
The night before I go, I can sense a dramatic depth of fear in my wife, a nervousness of whether this may be the last time she sees me. But if I take all that stuff into consideration, I'm not going to go. I have to cut out all that sentiment, pull that kind of softness, otherwise it's going to get to me. And I dread to think what it might be like for my family the day I don't come back. I mean, my wife would bring up a family of 3 children, because a child of 5 or 6 years of age would never really remember his father.
So again, layered on top of your personal story, there's quite a lot there. So switching slightly, do you think that you personally, how to put this, do you think that you personally would have learned as much about your mom had she interviewed, I don't know, chefs or musicians or fashion designers? Because to me, there's something special about the way that photographers consider the world, that maybe surface something salient to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what you were just saying. Like, I always say that this film is not about the photographers, even though if you're interested in photography, that might be your main motivation for wanting to see it. But for me, it's about these bigger issues that they were really important to my mother, and they were on her mind, they were on the photographer's mind, and they are related to photography. Time, memory, living in the moment. But for me, the more interesting thing is that they're just human questions. And I think that, had she talked to fashion designers or chefs or whatever, there's probably different questions that those professions and those kinds of creative people are considering. But I think photography in and of itself just was resonant with her because she was also thinking about all these questions that photography addresses, and that if you're a photographer, you're kind of trying to work out.
I want to apologize for the motorcycle that just went by in Brooklyn. So in one version of your trailer, you pose a question that I thought was pretty deep. And I'm going to ask it to you to see if you can answer it now. And that question is, can photos record the essence of one's life?
So in the process of making this film, I had a realization. It was actually when I attended a couple of different photography shows. One was of Lewis Hines' work, and another was of Deanne Arbus's work. And when I looked at their pictures, I realized that I was just feeling the essence of the photographer, not of the subject. So like with Lewis Hine, he photographed child laborers, and there was such empathy and tenderness and compassion in the photographs that if a different photographer had taken them, they might have felt cold or they might have felt some other way. But I realized I was feeling Lewis Hine. And in that moment, I just got that actually, whatever we create, part of us is in that creation. And it would be a great way to understand who my mother was through looking at what she created. And so that's kind of one of the things I'm trying to do in this film.
I love it. I love it. So you mentioned Bruce Davidson earlier, who your mother interviewed. And during that interview, he said something to you, who you re-interviewed. And in that moment, he said something to you along the lines of, Rachel, you have a lot of your mother in you. I wonder, how did that feel?
Well, from a young age, people have been telling me I look like her or, sound like her, whatever it is. And it's a weird thing to not remember someone who you remind people of. But when he said that, it was a wonderful, warm moment to know that not only did he remember her so many years later, but that he was connecting with me through that memory. And it kind of brought full circle what I was hoping to do by meeting him, which is, get some of his memories of what it was like when my mom went there and talked to him. So that was a really nice moment.
And did she meet with him once or multiple times?
I think it was at least 2 times. He said it was once, but I believe it was, based on the audio I have, I think it was more than one day. But yeah, I have these clues that I have to sort of figure out things based on what's left in the world.
But it was once or twice 40 years ago.
Yeah. And so what's really remarkable is that like he and Martine Frank and Don McCullin, the people that I was able to go back and interview, because many of the photographers were already passed away by the time I started this, but that they remembered so much. And Bruce Davidson in particular remembered so many details about what they talked about how she made him feel, about her smile, all these, about her voice, which I thought, like, if someone interviewed me, decades ago, how much would I really remember about that person from 1 or 2 days? So
you better remember everything about this moment.
I'll try my best.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, I think it is remarkable. And so I have to wonder, like, what was it about that meeting that was so resonant? Or what? Yeah. And it's just something that I think about.
So in the trailer that we saw at the top of our discussion, there's a moment where there's old home movie footage running, that shows you as a newborn, and, your mom's holding you and you're sort of crying softly, and her voice, she looks at you and the voice says, "What's that, sweetie? Do you want to say something?" And I'm wondering, Rachel, all these years later, is there something that you want to say to your mom?
Well, I think in the process of making this film and sort of piecing her together through all these materials, one thing that's happened is that I have conversations with her in my mind. Maybe it's not in my mind, maybe it's beyond that. But it's not about one specific thing, but oftentimes if I'm like grappling with a big decision, I'll ask her and then I'll hear an answer. And I don't know if it's my own inner wisdom that's coming through or if it's actually her speaking to me, but I like to believe that it's her. And so that's kind of how I talk to her these days.
I love that. So finally, tell us where the film is now and how we can help you support it and bring this amazing project into the world.
We are currently in post-production. I'm actually, for a few weeks, I'm in Los Angeles working with our editor, Eileen Meyer. And we are in the midst of a pitch contest where we could potentially win a very nice financial prize, which would help us get to a rough cut on the film. And so I believe that we're going to share that link in the chat. If you go, it takes just a couple seconds to vote, and it would be really helpful to the process. And voting is up until Monday. And you can also follow the film on Instagram if you want to know what's next, when it's going to be released, and see little bits of archival tidbits that I post for fun occasionally.
So, but the immediate thing is vote.
Yes.
That's what I'm hearing. Vote.
That would be extremely helpful. Yes.
Right. So we'll all do that. So we've got a few minutes for Q&A. So let's go ahead and see what we've got. And now's a great time to send in questions if you've been holding on to them. Okay. Rachel, are you ready?
I don't know. Let's find out.
Here's the first one. In what way do you think your mother has influenced your career path? And we know that home economics is not part of it, so.
I do love cooking, but yeah. I would say that it's more innate than it is that I feel influenced by her. So I just found out that I had the same interests and that I followed the same career path before I even knew what she did. So I think it says something maybe about, nature versus nurture, which is something to think about. But I think we're more influenced by nature than we might realize sometimes.
Yeah, I think you are right. And it must be gratifying or sort of soul-filling at some level to realize how much of her is in you just innately.
The good qualities, yeah. Sometimes we're like, well, why did I have to inherit this particular thing? But
right.
We all feel that way about our parents. It's good things and challenging.
So what was the, so speaking of challenging, what was the most challenging aspect of making this film?
Wow. It's basically like climbing Mount Everest, but there's a couple of things. I would say one, which most independent filmmakers will tell you, is fundraising. Unfortunately, that's, especially in America, we spend a good percentage of our time looking for money to make the film. But I would say personally, I think it's hard to focus on a really sometimes heavy personal story for so many years, because there's no escape from one's personal story in that case. It's not like I clock out at the end of the day.
Right.
So there's that element of, gosh, I'd love to just finish this thing and like move on with my life, which I'm working on doing.
Okay. Going to move away from the super emotional stuff just for a second and ask you a gear question that came in. Do you know how many of the photographers used Leicas?
I don't know. And I'm not much of like a gearhead myself. I'm more interested in story and connection and that kind of thing. So you might have to do a little Google research on that one. But I know that my father was a dedicated Leica shooter. I believe Cartier-Bresson was.
Well, I did notice when I put my eyeball right up to that photograph of Martine shooting you on the balcony that she was using a Leica as well. But that may be one that we can do some research on and post at some point. Do you see perhaps after the film comes out, a book, perhaps, maybe a book of the interviews and some of the pictures?
I definitely would like to do a book. I would also like to do an exhibit. I think there's a lot of, and maybe even a podcast. There's a lot of potential things. There's so much material I could never possibly use a tiny fraction of it in the film itself. And so there's lots of possibilities afterwards. And my mother had tens of thousands of photographs, most of which will not be in the film. So I'd love to do a book or exhibit of her work potentially as well.
Another one from the chat. Was there any advice from the interviews that stays with you personally? And I'm not sure if the questioner was asking about photographic advice, like don't overeat or overdrink, like Cartier-Bresson said, or, sort of deeper stuff, maybe about family and weighing things and,
Yeah. I would say more than advice, they're just really like universal and timeless questions that have got me thinking more about how I feel about certain things. And one of them was photographer Brian Linker, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer that probably most of you haven't heard of, but he had this great talk with my mom about what's more important, work or relationships or love. I think it was work or love were the two questions. And my mother was clearly grappling with that herself. And she was saying, I really need both. And he was saying, well, I think love is more important because at the end of the day, there's just a small handful of people that you matter to and vice versa. And that's more important than, a picture assignment or pictures. And kind of what McCullin was sort of saying too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this question of like, if you're going to be a successful photographer, there is this sort of obsession and this sort of you're traveling, you're on the road. But at what point are you sacrificing, your relationships and what else is important? I think that's an age-old sort of artist question that I also think about a lot.
So there were so many fantastic photographers on the list, and as you mentioned, many of them had passed away before you had a chance, before the project started and whatnot. But if there was one photographer on your mom's initial list that people that she spoke with that you could re-interview, living or dead, who might it be?
The list of people she actually interviewed, or the ones that she?
Yeah. Well, either way.
That's a great question. Well,
I'm easy. Yeah.
I would actually add a different one who might already have been passed away. So I'm going to change the question slightly, but I would have loved to have interviewed Margaret Bourke-White. Because I read her book called Portrait of Myself, and I just found it so incredibly inspiring. I mean, she was one of the only, if not the only, like female life photographer from day one. And she was just like kicking ass in like 19.
She had, of course, she famously had the first cover of Life magazine.
Was it that those buildings?
It was the Fort Peck Dam.
The dam, right.
Fort Peck Dam on the cover, and then inside the sort of worker community, shanty community that had popped up. And it is, the cover is extraordinarily gorgeous architectural photo. and then inside, sort of a deeply humanistic. So great choice. I love that.
She's incredible. Following that, I would say Gordon Parks.
And why Gordon Parks?
He also was such a trailblazer. He grew up as a Black man in, from a place where he wasn't expected to be a photographer. He wasn't welcomed into the places that he put himself, and he succeeded. And he did so many different amazing things. He was a composer, he was a filmmaker, he was a photographer, he was a writer. There were just no boundaries.
He co-founded Essence magazine.
I mean, he just did so many amazing things. And I think my mother, interestingly, related to each other because they both had their own limitations that they had to overcome in different ways, but they were very close friends.
They were.
Yeah. She writes about him quite a bit in her journals. And so for that reason, I would actually like to ask him about their relationship and find out more about that.
Do you remember how many times they met on the record?
Several. I know that he photographed her and vice versa. In fact, I have a whole contact sheet of pictures she took of him because he did a bunch of recordings for her or with her. So I know that they met several times, both in New York, even in the Middle East. They actually met up where they were both shooting something in Egypt. And several people I've interviewed for the film talk about their relationship and how important they were to each other.
That's incredible. Gordon Parks touched so many people like that and stands as, the word hero is overused, but I will use it here. So let me ask you, in this whole process, you've been making this film for some years. What has been the biggest challenge?
I think it's the personal challenge of just carrying around a story about loss and kind of having to dive deep into that and realizing at a certain point. I did the Sundance Edit and Story Labs a couple summers ago. And the thing they told me when they brought me in was, okay, you really have to dig deep. And I knew that I had to just get really vulnerable. So I think when you're making a story about your own family, about yourself, in order for it to be good, you really have to dig deep and live in that experience. And that's not an easy place to hang out, but I think it's important to make the best possible film. And so that is challenging.
Well, fantastic. So just to reiterate, the film is called A Photographic Memory. We're going to follow you on Instagram, and that's in the chat. And we are going to vote for your film with the hope that we push you over the top, secure you funding, and then very, very soon after that, we can all watch your movie, learn a ton, and cry a little. Thank you, Rachel, so much. And a huge thanks to Leica for allowing us to talk about this at so long and in so much depth. And thanks to everyone listening for your time. I'm Bill Shapiro. We will see you at the next Leica conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.